Welcome to this latest edition of the Toldinstone Q&A, where I answer your questions about the ancient Greeks and Romans. If you have a question about the classical world that you want addressed here, ask it in the comments, and I'll add it to my list. So, we'll start with question number 1, which is, was there any kind of public transportation in ancient Rome? This is asked by Lisa. Rome was an extremely crowded city, whose density was exceeded only by modern high-rise metropolises. It was really just insula upon insula upon insula. Now, there's a famous passage from Juvenal, which some of you may have read, which talks about the perils of walking in a city this crowded. The hapless pedestrian has walloped by a board, has his foot stomped by a hobnailed boot, other mishaps transpire. So it was hard to get around in Rome on foot, let alone by vehicle. People were routinely crushed to death during festivals when there was especially large crowds. And we hear about hapless tourists who broke their legs in uncovered sewers. So, to avoid making all of this mess even worse, Julius Caesar banned all wheeled vehicles from the streets of Rome between dawn and about mid-afternoon. Later, this ban was extended to include horses and mules. There were various exceptions for Vestal Virgins, for example, some kinds of construction traffic, but for the most part, Rome was vehicle-free during the busiest parts of the day. So, if you were rich and wanted to get around in some style, the only option was a litter. These began pretty simple, but quickly became very elaborate contrivances. So you'd have a closed box with glass windows sometimes, being carried by 2, 4, even 8 bearers, and perhaps someone with a club ahead to beat away through the crowds. Originally, only the rich could use these. So again, members of the imperial family, priests and priestesses, senators. But gradually, it was realized that there was a market for middle-class people who wanted to get around quickly and in some style. And so public litter-for-hire companies began to emerge in the 2nd century. And we actually have a notice of a taxi stand of sorts in what's now Trastevere. These companies, we don't know how big they were or how many they were, but they were apparently quite prosperous and survived for quite some time. And so these litters for hire are the best equivalent of public transportation in ancient Rome. Our next question from Nathaniel's Creative Collections is, how much do we know about life expectancy in ancient Rome? We have a lot of data, but nothing like statistics. The data comes from literary sources, from epitaphs, and in Egypt, from papyri. We even have what's called Ulpian's Life Table, a Roman document that outlined, for tax purposes, how much longer a person of a given age might be expected to survive. On the basis of all this and modern demographic modeling, scholars have certain broad brush estimates. It's thought that about half of all children died before adolescence, and those who reached the age of 30 had a decent chance of making 50 or 60, but not much beyond that. The truly elderly are quite rare in the ancient world. Because so many die in childhood, life expectancy at birth is probably between 20 and 30 years, the whole length and breadth of the classical world. We have census returns from Roman Egypt, which allow a more precise estimate. So one reading of that evidence is that in Roman Egypt, at birth, a male baby could expect to live about 25 years, a female baby about 22 years. Unlike their modern counterparts, Roman women tended to live less long than men, largely because childbirth was so dangerous. Many women suffered, or rather endured, a half dozen or more pregnancies, and each one had a great risk of sepsis and death. So, the long story short, not very long for most Romans. Life was nasty, brutish, and above all, short. Our next question from Luke Smith is, did the Romans really use feathers to purge after feasts? Well, to begin by dispelling one common myth, the Romans did have things called vomitoriums, but they were not rooms for purging. They were just the exits from theaters and amphitheaters. Now, the question of purging in general, we do have records of gluttons who did vomit after dinner. So Seneca, for example, writes that men eat to vomit and vomit to eat. But then Seneca was no fun. So we do know also that at least two emperors, Claudius and Vitellius, were known for purging after meals, but they were both notorious gluttons, so not exactly standard. We also know that many Romans, or perhaps not many Romans, a fair selection of elite Romans, purged after meals on medical advice. It was thought to be a good thing to clear the stomach of excess food and blood sometimes. And so Julius Caesar, for example, would take emetics after meals, and so vomit up his most recent comestibles. So many Romans, or again, a fair selection of elite Romans, may have purged after meals, but only a few because they were such gluttons that they needed to eat more than they could possibly hold. Our final question from Marcus Campus is, were there Doomsday Preppers during the fall of the Roman Empire? That's a fun question. So, the fall of the Western Roman Empire was a gradual process that lasted almost a century. It wasn't the sort of thing you could wait out in a bunker. Everyone knew the empire was in trouble, but it usually wasn't clear how much trouble until the barbarians came knocking at your door. That said, there were ways to make preparations, and many people did make those preparations. Now, I should qualify by saying that life in the ancient world was always uncertain. You wanted to hedge your bets. There'd be a bad harvest. The border might collapse around the frontier. There might be a civil war or a bad emperor. You always wanted to have reserves of food, of money, of friends, networks you could draw upon in times of need. And the ever more precarious state of the empire in the 5th century made that precariousness ever more evident. Now, there were many ways of dealing with the threat of civil war and invasion. Many towns, for example, built new circuits of walls in the 4th century especially, and they would actually tear through their old cemeteries and use the tombs, the great blocks of stone from mausoleums and headstones, in their new walls. But for individuals, the only people who had the resources to prep in any real sense were the wealthy. In the West, many of these men, these great magnates, withdrew from the turmoil and danger of the cities to fortified estates in the countryside. Here, on these vast, self-sufficient farms, they would have these villas that were essentially proto-castles, and would have bands of armed retainers, often just thugs with clubs and swords, to protect them. And they were quite self-sufficient, and in many ways were the closest equivalent to modern preppers in this sense. But when the barbarians actually came, these men were the first to make deals with the conquerors because they had the most to lose. So many of them would agree to give some of the revenue to the new barbarian kings. A few even learned German for convenience. We still find evidence for preppers routinely in the form of coin hoards, which reflect money that was squirreled away for future, hopefully better times. Of course, if the better times ever came, people who buried those hoards didn't get them because they stayed buried. There's additional evidence in the form of chapels and a growing investment in relics, which were a sort of supernatural insurance. Well, that wraps up this Q&A session. Again, if you have questions about the Greeks and Romans, ask them in the comments, and I'll be happy to address them as soon as I can. Thanks for watching.